Hello everybody, what's up and welcome back to another StarCraft 2 Ownage Shack production for Force Strategy Gaming. My name is David and I'm going to be bringing you a little Terran vs Protoss tutorial here today. Now before I get into that, I want to thank everyone who left me comments on the last video I did for FSG, the Protoss vs Protoss cast. If you haven't checked that out, please go watch. I appreciate all the comments you guys gave me. Once again, your advice is very helpful. And as I also noticed that a lot of you guys like that cast more than my first, so thank you doubly for the advice you gave me on the first one, because clearly it paid off and made my casting ability much better for the second. So now jumping right into this, you may have remembered from my first cast that was a game between Nama and PWR Elfie, where Nama went for a very strong tank contain versus his Protoss opponent. Now this is very, well, it's pretty not standard, to say the least. It's definitely novel, not something we see too much in Terran vs Protoss, but as we saw, it was very effective, and a lot of you commented that in the comment section of that video. So I thought I would give you a little tutorial on how to execute this strategy, as well as to give you a rundown of what Nama is thinking as he does it. So the first thing we notice here is his depot is going to be walling off this area so that any warp prism drops in the back or any kind of BS like that cannot do some damage versus your mineral line. Just going to prevent that from happening. The other thing we have to keep in mind here is that Nama is immediately walling off with a barracks. Now it's not a complete wall yet, but that's okay. The point is, this build is so tech oriented that you really need a wall here in order to deter any rushes from your opponent. Of course, the gas is going down at the standard time, 13 supply. Keep in mind a build order will be available for you in the description of this video, so don't worry too much about that right now. Now the other thing we notice is his SCV began scouting right after that depot was done, and that is quite important, to say the least. As you can see, he's getting very valuable information. He takes note that the gas is already out, which is standard. He's going to see the gateway, which is not producing anything yet. And he's also going to see how much chrono boost is on the Nexus. He sees that Duckload Raw is keeping well on top of his chrono boost, and is probably going to use that on his cybernetics core. Now the thing he notices before he leaves with this SCV is that the second gas has not been taken yet. And to be honest, if we look here, we can see that at 22 supply, you'd really expect your Protoss opponent to have taken that gas already, unless they were going for some kind of fast expansion, or perhaps the 4-gate build. Because he predicts a 4-gate, he throws this bunker up. Meanwhile, he's denying scouting with his first Marine, and immediately after that Marine is out, he pops on a tech lab to his barracks, produces a Reaper, and then gets his second refinery. The second refinery is very important. As I said, it's a tech-oriented build, and as we can see, wasn't quite on top of his supply. You're going to want to squeeze in a depot there too. Sadly for Nama, this was not possible because of the bunker that he put down, wasting 100 minerals. So as we can see, the bunker is very important, because look at this. If this bunker weren't there, we would have had a tough time defending against this Zealot. Of course, once the Reaper comes out, the Zealot is no longer a threat. But the Reaper is actually more of a scouting unit than anything. Keep in mind the factory went down immediately after he had 100 gas after the first Reaper. The Reaper will be used to try and scout the Protoss, because the build that we're going to use here depends very heavily on the unit composition of your opponent. Now, unfortunately for Nama, the Reaper does take the long way, and as such, he's not going to get vision of these. He will manage to make his way into the base, though. Now, keep in mind, while he's doing this, he's getting a Starport up immediately after the factory, and throwing down a tech lab. This will be used to swap up later. The Reaper has now made his way into Duckload Raw's base, and is going to be pecking away at the probes. Gets one. However, he should have actually come across this way so he could have seen these tech structures. Unfortunately, he's going to be forced to burn a scan to see what goes on here, and he will see a 1-gate robo build into a second gateway. Very much going to be pretty much a 3-gate robo build. Now, one thing to note, if you see a Stargate with that build, cancel your Starport immediately and throw down 2 barracks. Mass pump Marines and tanks, get siege mode, get stim, because they're going to do a very strong timing push with Void Rays and Stalkers. If you defeat that push, don't waste any time, just go and own them fast. They will have nothing left. Trust me, this is something that Protoss players do against me all the time when they see this wall. They're instantly tempted to go for Void Rays because they can charge up on it. It's a huge mistake though, and if you counter it properly, you should have no problem versus that. Meanwhile, we see the Banshee is now coming out of the Starport. Same with the Siege Tank from the factory. We don't see any upgrades yet. And the Banshee is actually going to just be used to try and force your opponent into getting more Stalkers. we're not going to invest in Cloak for the Banshee. Instead, we're just going to hopefully make more Stalkers so that we get a Raven out of here second and then nullify these forces with the point defense drone. The Banshee is going to be doing some harassment as well, and you can usually get some scouting in too. We see the very strong 3-gate robo push is now coming, as we can see here. And he's got the pylon set up, and really what you're going to need versus this is more bunkers, and that is why Nama has placed these down here. The siege tank is now out, 3 Marines will be loading up in here, meanwhile the Banshee is doing some harassment. Fortunately that's going to be nullified by a Stalker warp in. Now you need to pull all your SCVs at this point and hopefully repair these bunkers in time. If you can deflect this push, you are going to be in a very advantageous spot. We see the siege tank is crucial. The siege tank should be out in time if you followed this build, and you're going to want to focus down the Immortals, as we can see that Nama is doing right now, because they're going to easily rip through these bunkers. Once the first Immortal is down, you should have no problem deflecting the rest. As you can see, Ducklodraw is forced to back out. Now at this point, I'm going to go into Nama's cam so we can see the game from his perspective. Of course, I'm going to actually move it around myself, otherwise we'd all get pretty sick. So, as we can see, when we saw that push come, we saw very Zealot heavy, so sadly Ducklodraw did not fall for our Raven scheme, and as such that's fine. We can now continue to make more Banshees, which are very good versus a Zealot heavy composition. Meanwhile, we're going to get more Marines, some Marauders, but not too many, as well as more tanks. Siege mode has now been researched, very important there, because you're going to need that siege tank to deflect round 2 of any push that he might throw at you. Now we're going to almost have that Raven out. Repair your Banshees, stay on top of your supply. Really, what we're going to be aiming for here is a very strong 2-base timing push. And once you get a critical mass of tanks, it should be very effective against your opponent. As you can see, we're continuing to check around here. We see a Stalker is now over here. That's a little bit of cause for worry, but that's okay, because with your tanks you should be very safe versus any push that he might throw at you after that. Meanwhile, we see Banshees are going in once again for more scouting. As we can see here, he's just going to check around the base, see if anything's coming. And look, with this Banshee, he manages to see this Warp Prism coming. So what does he do? He brings his Marines and his Raven right into position over here to deal with that. Very good play by Nama. Meanwhile, we see that Stim is now being researched. Also, keep in mind that more Marines are being produced all the time, and we're going to get 2 additional barracks at this time. We can see there the Warp Prism is forced to go away because we were able to spot it with that Banshee. That's how important these air units are in this build. Now, keep in mind, please, that these barracks would have come down at an earlier time had it not been for that first push, which did set us back slightly. So when reading the build order, please keep in mind that it is very dependent on what your opponent is doing. Nice to use the Raven actually to get rid of observers as well. And he feels pretty safe in throwing down these auto turrets because he did see such a Stalker light composition. Point defense drone really isn't going to be too good. However, now he sees a bunch of Stalkers, so he should be switching that up. Notice we were able to see the expansion with the Banshee. That's very important. Going to mean that we need to expand ourselves, which you see that Nama is now doing, or do a very strong all-in. This is not an all-in strategy. Those are very risky. Nama prefers to play more safe, so it will be a 2-base play. We see that we now have quite a few tanks, and these will do extremely well versus those Stalkers we saw, and the Marines should be able to shred any Zealots or Immortals he might throw at us, with the Banshees, of course. Now, what you're going to want to do, of course, get these reactors on these barracks. Now, keep in mind, if we saw Colossi at this point, we would absolutely not want reactors on these barracks. We might be able to get away with 1 reactor, but the other would need to be a tech lab. We want more Marauder heavy play versus Colossi. Also, Banshees should do very well versus Colossi. So, now we're just going to be moving out here, checking what's going on, using the Marine to do some forward scouting, and what happens? A Warp Prism drop. This is always something very annoying to deal with, but there's really no way you can deal with this except Vikings. And that is why Nama chose to get a Viking out of his Starport. It's completely up to you. The Viking can be used to patrol this area for any Warp Prisms that might be coming in. And the other useful thing is, as we saw, he was able to snipe that Warp Prism with that Viking. If the Viking had not been there, the Warp Prism could have simply lifted off and gone over here. This is the timing you want to hit for your attack. Once your expansion is just about done, and you're going to be wanting about 4 or 5 tanks. Now, he did send these units up first so he could see if the army was waiting for him. If the army was waiting, we would have wanted to siege up down here before proceeding, but because it wasn't, we feel safe and now sieging up these tanks right outside his ramp. Now you want to bring SCVs over here to build bunkers, turrets, pretty much a ton of static defense in order to really contain them. Meanwhile, split up their army with drops, as you can see he's done with this medevac, and keep tabs on their army. We can see that he's now bringing a ton of forces over here, so we're going to want to test the front over here. We see tons of zealots. Going to want to back up the tanks a bit in case they have charge, and we will see him do that right now. Meanwhile, keep these forces up here. There is an observer somewhere around here, so keep in mind that Duckload Raw does indeed have vision of this, but it's very difficult to deal with as a Protoss player. You can also tell that this would be very effective on Lost Temple. And now this Psystorm tells us he's going for storms, and that's going to make these bunkers doubly important because they can shield our units from the psionic storm. The tanks have now been backed up. The Raven is here, ready to cast a PVD if necessary. And look, Duckload Raw simply cannot, he can't get out of his base. The siege tanks, the damage they deal stacks up so highly on this ramp that there's really nothing that Duckload can do to get out of here. We're now going to be committing even more forces to this ledge. Of course, this is entirely map dependent. On a different map without this ledge, such as Metalopolis, you'll simply just want to use more bunkers on a more wide open area and continue with the same strategy. Now, as you can see, he's further split up the forces over here, and because of that, he's going to take this opportunity to hopefully poke up in the main and see what's going on there. As you can see here, the medevac is getting ready, more bunkers are being placed down, and he scans, goes up. Because the forces are so split, there's really no way that Duckload Raw can deal with this. And after losing these two High Templars, which is absolutely devastating, we can see that the contain has indeed succeeded. Duckload is completely pinned to one base, and we can easily expand if we wanted to. And because of that, Duckload calls GG, and Nama takes this game. So anyways, that's going to be the tutorial for today. Now I'm just going to go over some key points in this build that I want you to take note of. The first very important thing, let me just pause this, the carnage continues for minutes after this game finishes for some reason. The first thing that's important, getting this barracks down at the ramp because we're going for tech, we need defense. Second thing is that we're going to get one Marine, then a tech lab. After the tech lab, we grab that Reaper to scout their base. And remember, look for that Starport because we have to adjust our build for that. Right after the Reaper, we throw it on a second refinery, then a factory, then a Starport. So essentially, it's a little bit of a variation of a 1-1-1 play. After this is done, really what you scout with the Reaper is going to depend on what you do next. If you see one base Colossi, get more Marauders, get a few more Banshees, and you can pretty much forget the Raven altogether. It's not going to be as useful because he's probably going to be very Stalker light because of that. Now, the other important thing is to note that this is a two-base timing push. So you're going to want to make sure that you have this base up and running before you go out, and you're going to want to have quite a few siege tanks. 4 or 5 usually does the job. Once you do that, the only other thing you have to be wary of is if their army is out here. If that's the case, and this could be any map, make sure you siege your tanks up first, then move forward with the infantry. Once you do that, and you get these bunkers up, you pretty much have a stranglehold on the game, and you should easily be able to contain them to a win. So, thank you so much for watching. Really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, any comments you might have, or feedback, any advice is always appreciated here. So, thank you very much. If you want to see more tutorials like this, be sure to check out my channel. Link should be in the description along with the build order. Peace out, guys.